Hello historians, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Prof J. I am your history professor. And in today's presentation, we're going to be taking a look at Europe in the early Middle Ages. We'll take a look at a new dynasty that emerges, the Carolingian dynasty, and its most famous figure, Charles the Great or Charlemagne, and the empire he creates, which will be Europe's largest between this point and Napoleon in the 19th century. We'll then explore how political power fragmented and became decentralized due to the actions of Charlemagne's grandsons in the Treaty of Verdun, as well as repeated invasions of Europe by Muslims from the south, Magyars from the east, and Vikings from the north. In this decentralized context, we'll examine the twin systems of vassalage and manorialism. Vassalage was a system in which warriors swore an oath of loyalty and military service to a superior called a lord and received grants of land in return, while manorialism was based on a manor, an agricultural estate run by a lord and worked by serfs and free peasants. We'll also take a look at how Christianity, or more specifically the Catholic Church, was influencing society and culture in Europe, particularly in regards to marriage, to the family, and to the way children were viewed in society. Finally, for this presentation, we'll take a moment to look at what's going on in the Islamic world, focusing on a new dynasty that rises to power in 750, the Abbasid dynasty, and how they were much less militaristic and more focused on culture, education, and tolerance. Without further ado then, it is time for history, so let's dive in. Hello historians, today's presentation is on Europe in the early Middle Ages. If you're a student in my class, as always, there's a forum that accompanies this lesson in the early Middle Ages module in our course LMS. So please access that forum now if you haven't already. For non-students who may be watching this video, welcome! I hope you enjoy the video and learn something about Europe during its early medieval period. Well, I think I've given my students enough time to access the forum, so on with the show. As someone who studied the European Middle Ages in grad school, and is a fan of the Middle Ages in general, I'm super excited we finally got into this segment of class, so let's not waste any time and jump right in. The theme we're working with here is that at the beginning of this lesson, which covers a period of 250 years, from 750 to 1000 CE, political power was centralized under the Merovingian dynasty, the one begun by Clovis, who we covered in Unit 7. As we proceed through this presentation, we'll see political power began to fracture, and instead of being concentrated in the hands of a single monarch, was divided among many different aristocrats and stakeholders throughout Europe. As we near the end of this period, 1000 CE, we see the start of power becoming centralized once again, a process that will continue in future lessons. Before we get into the details of these processes of fracturing and consolidating political power, let's take a brief moment to look at the larger context of Europe. Europe consisted of forested land that covered most of the landscape. Land was hard to clear for farming, as first trees had to be felled, then the roots dug out, painstaking and time-consuming tasks. Farms then were just difficult to set up. As a result, Western Europe had few large cities, and people mostly lived in small, isolated villages. These small villages did not produce much, so many people lived precarious lives, much of the time on the edge of starvation, such that one bad growing season or one harsh winter could spell disaster. It's in this context that the political developments described here occurred. Recall that in Unit 7 I discussed Clovis and the beginning of the Merovingian dynasty. Things changed with a man named Charles Martel. He was not part of the Merovingian family, but rather a high-ranking officer for them. In 732, he led the forces that defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Poitiers, effectively halting Muslim expansion into Western Europe. This victory cemented his legacy and allowed him to build up power behind the scenes. Charles' son, Pepin, overthrew the Merovingians in 741 and established his family as the new leaders, a dynasty that would come to be called the Carolingian. Pepin was not only crowned king of the Franks, he was also anointed with holy oil by the Pope, thus receiving the blessing of the Catholic Church to rule and establishing a precedent future European rulers would follow. Pepin's son Charles would become one of the greatest figures of the early Middle Ages in Europe, and is now known to history as Charles the Great or Charlemagne. He became king in 768 and would rule until his death in 814. Charlemagne was a warrior king who fought dozens of battles during his lifetime. He waged wars in Italy, Spain, and Germany. Using an army of only a few thousand men, he subdued much of Western Europe, creating an empire that would not be matched until Napoleon in the 19th century. In Charlemagne's empire, there was no system of taxation, so if he needed resources for more campaigns, he had to rely on lands he directly controlled to provide. In order to keep members of the nobility happy, Charlemagne granted lands to those who proved loyal to him. He divided his empire into districts, each administered by a count, who oversaw the execution of justice, led the military forces, and served in general as an agent of the king. Counts, however, could try to enhance their own power at the expense of Charlemagne's, and even try to challenge him for the throne. In order to prevent this, Charlemagne made sure the positions were appointive, not hereditary, meaning they could not be passed from father to son. If a man died in office, Charlemagne had to appoint a new man as count. Additionally, he had every count serve outside of the lands they grew up in, and he periodically moved them around in order to break up any base or following they might be building in an area. Finally, he also created a new position, the Missi Dominici. They consisted of pairs of officers, one secular and one from the church, to travel the empire and check up on the counts to ensure they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Because of the vast distances and the difficulty of travel, however, this political system was horribly inefficient. Counts did in fact have a lot of freedom to act independently. What normally kept them in line was the obligation they felt, personally, to Charlemagne. This notion of loyalty and obligation will play a big part in the more decentralized Europe that we'll explore in a few moments. In 799, the Pope, Leo III, was having difficulties in Rome. His problems were so serious that he was personally attacked and beaten. He left the city and made for Charlemagne's court. The Pope asked for help in putting down those rebelling against him, and Charlemagne pledged his support. After dealing with Leo's opponents, in 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans in the West, a title that had not been used since 476, when Romulus Augustulus, as you'll remember, was deposed. This event is significant for two main reasons. First, Charlemagne was now on the same level as the emperor in Constantinople, and the church in the West had a defender so that it did not have to rely on said emperor. Second, it also signified the creation of a new type of culture in Europe. Recall that in Unit 7, I discussed the fusion of Germanic and Roman culture. Well, here we have Charlemagne, a German king being crowned Emperor of the Romans by a Catholic Pope. He basically becomes the personification of this new Germano-Roman Christian culture that will take root and develop over the centuries. It's time for our first review of this lesson. First, the Merovingian dynasty was overthrown by Pepin, the son of Charles Martel. Pepin's son, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, became king in 768. He waged war across Europe, granted land to loyal followers, and used counts to oversee the territory he controlled. Finally, in 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans in the West by the Pope after aiding him against his enemies. The empire of Charlemagne, as is true with all empires, did not last forever. His grandsons agreed to the Treaty of Verdun, which split the empire into 3 parts. Charles the Bald received the western portion, lands which over time would become France. Louis the German received the eastern portion, lands that would over time become Germany. Lothar, meanwhile, received the title of emperor and ruled a, quote, middle kingdom, stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to central Italy in the south. Future generations would continue to divide the former empire into smaller and smaller chunks, and wars fought between them would continue to fracture the empire into pieces. There was another factor that helped the fragmentation of political power in Europe: a series of invasions from various groups like the Muslims, Magyars, and Vikings. Muslims used bases in North Africa to launch attacks on southern Europe, particularly Italy, southern France, and Mediterranean islands. These attacks were not for the purpose of conquering more territory, but rather as a means of securing trade enclaves in Europe. The Magyars were originally from Western Asia and began migrating west. They pushed into Eastern, then Central Europe, before being defeated in battle in 955 at the Battle of Lechfeld, after which they settled in Eastern Europe in what is now the nation of Hungary. The biggest threat, however, came from the Vikings. The Norsemen were Germans from Scandinavia who began leaving their homelands for reasons that are still only speculative. They had 2 advantages that aided their attacks. First, they were tremendous warriors. Second, they were also excellent shipbuilders. Viking longships were sturdy enough for travel on the open seas, as evidenced by a Viking colony founded in Canada nearly 500 years before Columbus, quote, discovered America. Further, with a shallow draft, Viking ships could also sail up rivers that cut across Europe, allowing them to go virtually anywhere. Some Vikings focused on England, attacking monasteries and eventually creating an area of control called the Danelaw. And if local leaders did not pay tribute, Vikings would raid further inland. Other groups of Vikings focused on Western Europe. Paris was attacked, as were other places in northern France and the Low Countries of Belgium and Holland. Yet other Viking groups went east, using the extensive river systems of Eastern Europe and Russia to push far enough inland that they made contact with the Byzantine Empire. The Vikings are mostly known for raiding and plundering, which they certainly did quite a bit of. But they were also great traders, and they established trade networks wherever they went. Recent archaeological excavations in Denmark have revealed Viking strongholds that contained valuables from all over Europe, and even artifacts that originated from Asia, demonstrating how plugged in to international trade the Vikings were. Eventually, the raiding subsided. Strong kings emerged in Scandinavia and tamped down on the attacks. Some groups of Vikings also began settling down in areas they once raided. For example, a French king granted land in northern France to Vikings in return for protection from other Viking groups. This land is now known as Normandy, or the land of the Northmen. Vikings also converted to Christianity, which did seem to have an impact in pacifying them. The attacks by Muslims, Magyars, and Vikings had an important political impact. Kings proved ineffective and weak in the face of onslaughts from foreigners, and many peasants began looking to their nearest noble for protection. This empowered said nobles to begin claiming powers and rights for themselves that enhanced their own status at the expense of kings. Because attacks were taking place all over Europe, political power everywhere was fragmenting. The result was a Europe that was not controlled by powerful kings ruling as absolute monarchs, but rather weak kings treated as equals. In many cases, nobles controlled more land and wealth than did kings. The fragmentation of political power gave rise to new twin systems, vassalage and Manorialism. It's time for another review. First, Charlemagne's empire was split in three by his grandsons with the Treaty of Verdun. Second, Western Europe was being invaded by Muslims from the south, Magyars from the east, and the Norse from the north. Lastly, these attacks had important consequences. Political power in Europe fragmented, as kings were ineffective at protecting their people, and local nobles grew in wealth and power. Vassalage was a system in which warriors swore an oath to fight for a lord. Therefore, a vassal was a person who swore to serve another in a military capacity. Nobles could not obtain and maintain power without warriors to fight for them, so they recruited men who were willing to swear an oath to fight. These warriors usually received land in return, land worked by peasants, so the warriors, increasingly called knights, could train for war. It took a great deal of practice to fight effectively on horseback, to move in a suit of armor, and to wield numerous types of weapons. Knights, therefore, could not be bothered to work their own land. That's what peasants were for. But we'll return to the peasants momentarily. For now, we're still focusing on the knights and the men they fought for. The land that a lord, the one a vassal swears an oath to, granted was known as a fief, or fief land. Because at this time in Europe gold and silver coins were rare, and most people bartered goods for other goods, land was the most valuable currency around. It's important to note that land was not owned by anyone in the way we think of ownership today. Medieval records do not refer to who owns the land, rather they refer to who holds it. That is, who was granted the land by someone else. A vassal, therefore, did not own the fief land granted to him. He held it from his lord, which implied that said fief land could be taken away from the vassal if he did not meet his obligations to his lord. Great lords who controlled vast tracts of land could grant large parcels to a number of vassals for their support, so they could become skilled in the art of war and defend and protect their lord. Some vassals who were granted large estates could then grant part of that land in turn to someone who became their vassal, meaning someone could be both a vassal to a lord and a lord themselves simultaneously. This process is known as sub-infeudation, a big fancy word you can use to win at Scrabble. Does anyone still play Scrabble, or am I dating myself with that game reference? Some form of hierarchy began to emerge then, as some lords were greater than others and had more vassals, who in turn could also serve as lords of their own vassals. There weren't that many layers to this, however, as land could only be divided so much before the estates were too small to support even a single knight. Usually the collection of the greatest lords, those who had accumulated the greatest amount of land and had the largest army, considered themselves as equals. These top-tier lords would often choose one of their number to be deemed king and anointed with holy oil by the church as a means of legitimating the entire system. That king, however, was often the weakest of the lords, making it difficult for him to be able to assert any real authority or power over the others, which allowed them to basically do whatever they wanted. The system of vassalage was held together by personal loyalty, oath-swearing, and mutual obligations. We've already seen in this lesson how Charlemagne's empire was kept together through personal loyalty to him, and that element still existed in the more decentralized Europe of the 9th and 10th centuries. However, Another tie that bound everyone together was a series of mutual obligations. Lords were obligated to protect their vassals by coming to their aid militarily or legally in court cases. They also had to help support their vassals, usually through the granting of fief land. Vassals had their own obligations to the lord. First and foremost, vassals had to serve their lords militarily, usually with their own person. Some vassals also agreed to provide a number of knights for their lord's army should he need them. Vassals were also usually obligated to provide hospitality to their lord should he come to visit them, which many did as a means of checking up on their vassals. Another obligation consisted of payments made to the lord for the ransoming of his person should he be captured in battle, the knighting of the lord's oldest son, and the marrying of his oldest daughter. Finally, vassals would often be obligated to serve on their lord's court, offering advice and guidance. If one of the two sides neglected their obligations, they were in violation of their oath. Should a vassal violate the oath that they swore to their lord, it could mean having their fief land confiscated, leaving them with nothing. Other forms of wealth could be taken from them if the lord chose, however. Should the lord fail to meet his obligations, vassals would usually band together and refuse to meet their obligations, or would even threaten war against their own lord. The system of vassalage then centered on personal relationships and knowing the right buttons to push and when to push them. Let's pause here and review the information on vassalage we just covered. First, a vassal swore an oath of loyalty and obedience to a lord, served him in a military capacity, and received land called a fief in return. Second, some vassals with a lot of land could sublet it to others who became their vassals. Finally, vassals owed their lords other obligations beyond their military service, such as court service and economic payments. I mentioned earlier how the warriors, or knights, that pledged service to a lord needed peasants to work land so they could spend all of their time practicing the art of war. The system of manorialism thus emerged to fulfill that need. Manorialism is based on a manor, an agricultural estate run by a lord and worked by peasants. These landed estates provided resources for lords and the knights who fought for them. During the chaotic 9th and 10th centuries, as political power decentralized, kings were weak, and invasions from outside actors were a serious threat. Many ordinary peasants across Europe needed protection, and turned to local nobles in order to get it. Most of the time, they made a deal. They would give up their freedom and become tied to the land they worked in return for protection from their new lord. They became serfs, or people tied to the land who were responsible for a number of different obligations and subject to many fines and fees. While they could not be bought and sold like property, as enslaved people were, their lives weren't much better. A manor included land that was controlled or held, as we discussed earlier, by the lord, as well as land held by serfs that had been granted to them by their lord for their own sustenance. However, serfs owed rent for said land, usually a certain percentage of the goods harvested from serf land. Serfs were also expected to work the land held by the lord, as they were too busy training to work it themselves. Serfs received no portion of the goods from this land, all went to the lord. Additionally, serfs were obligated to use the mill or oven located on the land, and paid a fee for the pleasure. They also had to pay a fee to use the common pasture and to fish in the rivers or lakes on the manor, if any. Finally, serfs paid a number of other fines and fees not related to work. For example, a fee was paid to get married, a fee was paid when a serf died on the land, and the lord could charge an arbitrary fee on all people living on his land anytime he wished. Manors came in all shapes and sizes. A manor could consist of a single village, or multiple villages could be wrapped up as a single manor. A lord may be in charge of a single manor, or if they were higher up on the food chain, so to speak, they may control many manors spread over a vast area, and use proxies to run many of them. Furthermore, different lords would impose different fines, fees, and rules on their serfs, depending on what they needed and their personality. Most lords also executed justice on their manors, giving rise to something called manorial law. If two serfs or free peasants were disputing over something too small to take to the king's court, their local noble would exercise the authority to arbitrate. This gave lords lawmaking abilities concerning day-to-day activities on the manor. By the middle of the 10th century, we see the seeds of centralization of political power being planted. In Germany, Otto I, who ruled as king from 936 to 973, defeated the Magyars at Lechfeld and got involved in the affairs of northern Italy. He also used bishops to help run the kingdom, as bishops were celibate and therefore would not produce any heirs to claim hereditary right to the position. In 987, Hugh Capet was chosen as the king in France, despite only controlling an island of land around the city of Paris. Nobody at the time could have predicted that Hugh's line would rule France for hundreds of years and establish the most powerful kingdom on the continent. In England, the presence of the Vikings created unity among the Anglo-Saxon nobles, who under Alfred the Great fought back the Norsemen and divided the land into administrative districts called shires, each run by an official called a shire reeve, or sheriff. Although the process of centralization was often a slow one, by the late 900s we definitely see the beginning of a new round of it happening across Europe. Let's pause here, take a breather, and review the material on manorialism. First, manors were agricultural estates run by lords and worked by serfs and free peasants. Second, serfs were tied to the land and farmed their own plots, as well as land directly controlled by the manorial lord. They paid their lord a percentage of the crops they grew on their land, but were not allowed to take anything from the lord's land. Third, manors came in all shapes and sizes, and manorial lords established their own rules and laws serfs and peasants had to follow. Finally, by the middle of the 10th century, we see the process of power being concentrated into the hands of kings begin in England, France, and Germany. It's now time to move away from political developments and move into some religious and social ones. Let's take a look at how medieval Europe was influenced by Christianity. Christian monks played a major role in preserving classical knowledge. Recall that in Unit 7, I discussed that monks spent part of their time copying classical texts, both Christian and pagan. That process continued in the early Middle Ages, as scriptoria, or writing rooms, were used to copy texts of all sorts. Fully 90% of Roman texts we have available to us today were originally preserved by monks in scriptoria. During Charlemagne's era, monks also developed a new script called Carolinian minuscule that consisted of lowercase letters and spaces between words. The Catholic Church had its biggest impact on the family. Frankish custom allowed for men, especially wealthy and powerful men, to have an official wife to produce children, but also to have concubines, women for sexual gratification. The church wanted to end the practice of concubinage, and so took steps to emphasize marriage. They created a special ceremony highlighting the union of two people with the blessing of the church. Marriages that did not go through this ceremony and did not receive the church's blessing were deemed illegitimate. The church also pushed the idea of permanence in marriage, that a marriage ceremony and the vows given therein creates an unbreakable bond, no matter how horrid the person you married turned out to be. In order to try and protect women who may find themselves forced into terrible marriages, The church also argued that girls over 15 had to consent to be married. Once they were, however, the rule of marriage permanence applied to them every bit as it applied to men. The church also stressed the idea of monogamy, arguing that once a couple was married, there should be no sexual relations with any other people. This was directly targeted toward ending the practice of concubinage. Frankish clans also valued the extended family over the nuclear family, but the influence of the church began to change all of that. The emphasis on permanent monogamous marriages was combined with the idea that the purpose of sexual activity was for producing children only. Because of this, activities that did not produce legitimate children, such as concubinage, were strictly outlawed. Additionally, homosexuality was condemned, as it would lead to sexual activities that would not lead to children. Abortion was likewise forbidden by the church, as was infanticide. These prohibitions went along with new thoughts on children. We've discussed previously how ancient societies did practice infanticide and various abortion techniques as a means of limiting children and family size. The church, however, argued that children, as miracles from God, were to be raised by their parents. Thus, more focus was put on the nuclear family of parents and their children, and less attention was paid to the extended family. Any children who were unwanted were to be left with monasteries or convents to be raised as monks or nuns. Marriage was still seen as the second best option, however, as abstinence was seen as the surest way to avoid the temptations of the flesh and live a more spiritual life. Celibacy for the clergy was an absolute, and virginity and chastity, especially for women, was still very important. Although Islam wasn't developing in Europe proper, nonetheless there are some developments we should take a quick minute to discuss. In Unit 7, I discussed how Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, was assassinated and a new dynasty, the Umayyad, took power. In 750, that dynasty was overthrown and the Abbasid dynasty began, which would last until 1258. The Abbasids were much less militaristic, stressing education and culture over fighting. They focused on intellectual pursuits, and the period from 750 to 900 is often referred to as Islam's Golden Age. They were also more inclusive than the previous dynasty, making conscious efforts to include non-Arab Muslims by allowing them to hold office. They were especially keen on courting the Persians, who had experience in governing and administration going back to Cyrus the Great and Darius. The Abbasid dynasty were also heirs of the Classical Age, as Muslim scholars translated Greek and Roman texts into Arabic for studying. While Europe was beginning its Middle Ages, and people were focusing on simply surviving from one day to the next, Muslims were reading Greek and Roman texts on science, medicine, government, and history. Anything Muslim scholars could reconcile with the Quran, they ate up. Philosophy was more problematic, though, as many Muslims felt the truth was contained in the Quran, so why did more discussion need to take place? There were some who translated Plato, Aristotle, and others, and argued that there was nothing wrong with seeking more knowledge. Muslim scholars also invented algebra, the astrolabe, a device used in sea navigation, created a medical encyclopedia, and passed on their number system, including the use of zero, which they had inherited from India. The Abbasids also built a new capital city, Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq. The city was well suited on multiple trade routes and became fabulously wealthy as a result. Great wealth, however, led to greed and corruption, which in turn led to some becoming very upset with Abbasid leadership. Eventually, this discontent would lead to fragmentation of the Islamic Empire, as both Spain and Egypt pulled away from the Abbasids and formed their own independent caliphates. It's now time for the final review for this lesson. First, the Catholic Church tried to reduce the practice of concubinage among the Franks by introducing the marriage ceremony and the idea of permanence in marriage. Second, Catholic beliefs also caused a shift from the extended family to the nuclear family, and prohibited sexual activities that were not for the purposes of procreation. Third, the Abbasid dynasty came to power in the Islamic world in 750, and the first century and a half of their rule is considered a golden age of learning and culture. Lastly, the decadence of the Abbasids would eventually lead to both Spain and Egypt breaking away and establishing their own caliphates. That does it for Unit 8. Today we looked at how political power fragmented and then began to re-centralize in Europe. And we also examined how society in the early Middle Ages was influenced by Christianity. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comment section below. If you'd like to know more about some of the topics discussed in this lesson, here's a short list of books you can check out to get started. Finally, please be kind to everyone in the comment section. No insults, no name calling, no hatred. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all again in the next video.